So let's take a look at our discussion questions. What were the major accomplishments and failures of Herod the Great? Is he a Jewish hero or not?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't call him a hero. He murdered his sons out of fear of them taking over. That's more like a Greek god stuff. But I mean, building things that we find in archaeology is cool.
I think you'd call him a collaborator.
Yeah.
I mean, he's really like, if you look at any colonial era, he's like the colonial chief who was collaborating with the regime in order to maintain power for himself. And really, he further Jewish interests only in the sense of maybe preserving Judea for a while longer, but not really, I wouldn't call him a hero in any sense. No.
I mean, he built roads, he built cities, he developed the economy, he built the aqueduct, he provided public order, all those positives provided in the Monty Python clip we saw early on. But he also built pagan temples. So he expanded the Jerusalem temple and he built pagan temples at the same time. So, the Judeans weren't sure what to do with him because he was helping their temple, but he was also killing people and he was building these pagan temples at the same time. Okay, second, what were the major differences among the major sects of Judaism in this period? And can this be a model for modern day Jewish pluralism or not? We sort of went over these major sects and their ideology. One thing I hadn't mentioned today, which we talked about last time, was the Hellenistic Jews and this wisdom tradition of studying the universe to understand the will of God and the plan for the universe, but also trying to acculturate the Greek ideas and practices while maintaining some kind of Jewish tradition. So the second question is more the relevant one. Can this be a model for modern day Jewish pluralism or not?
I hope that we'd be a little better than them, considering how antagonistic they were to each other. I'd hope that we can improve on what they had. But I mean, if you're just talking about, well, even then, I mean, you can say, oh, look, there were different groups then, but I have a feeling some of the more like Orthodox people would be like, and only the rabbis were right.
Yes, heresy does not disprove the truth of the true religion.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. There are this is an example of the history of Jewish diversity, but it's more like plurality than pluralism. If you think of pluralism as an ideology, a positive, that we have tolerance and respect for each other, that's not really what was going on in this time period. But the idea that there are multiple ways to be Jewish and they argue with each other, that's always been the tradition. Third question, what were the major consequences of the major Jewish revolts against Roman rule in Judea? So we had the Great Revolt in 67 to 73, which destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, allowed the rabbis to take over, create their new center in Yavne, and begin collecting rabbinic teachings. And again, in that classic maneuver of wiping out the previous power structure, the basis of Sadducee power was the temple in Jerusalem, that they were the high priests who got to run things, even if they had to work with the Pharisees. No temple anymore, no absolute authority for the Cohens, for the high priests. In fact, what remains in rabbinic life for people who are descended from priestly lines are some particular rules about purity and marriage laws, and they get the first Torah reading and they have a special blessing in the synagogue, and that's about it. You don't have to be a Cohen to be a rabbi. You don't have to be a Cohen to be a political leader of the Jewish community. In fact, claiming descent from major rabbis or from King David becomes more important than being a descent from a priest, because the priests are passé. That make yourself ready for when the temple comes again, and we'll let you know when that is. That's where the priests are left. Just as the priests took over with the kings and prophets getting eliminated, so too now the priests are sidelined.
I think that one of the key things about the revolts is that it puts the kibosh on the political aspirations of Jews. So at least until the 20th century, there is no longer this, I mean, sure, they say, next year in Jerusalem, but I mean, reality is that the political state is dead. There isn't a center anymore to go back to, in a sense. So the diaspora becomes the important aspect of it, and it can be anywhere. And they direct their energies to interpreting the scriptures and living the proper life more than trying to be a political entity, which means that they allow themselves to be subservient to various political entities that they in fact find themselves in, whether it's Spain or England or the Ottoman Empire or whatever it is. And
Right.
they become, so that becomes a very different sort of community in a sense. And I think in a way, I'm sorry to have long-winded here,
No,
but I
fine.
think in a way, it opens them up to being scapegoats, because not having political power means that being powerless in that sense, they become the object of contempt and the scapegoat for things that go wrong, that people can blame the Jews for things. And we see this throughout, especially in Europe, but also I think in Egypt and in some other areas, they become the objects of, it's their fault. And they don't have the political power to object to that.
You know, what I want to say is, I want to say yes and to what you're saying to complicate both pieces. Just because you're a subordinate political community doesn't mean you don't do politics. You're just not doing politics in the same way as autonomous kingdoms. You know, the Armenians as a diaspora community did political negotiations with, they had to negotiate with the Lord the terms of Jews being able to live in a city. And so there is, it's a kind of the politics of a minority subordinate community, but there is a kind of politics with the larger power. And internal politics too, of course. You know, you get people together, they're going to argue about things and have power structures and so on. And the other point is, you're right, they didn't have one center to go to. But when you use the term diaspora, there's an implication of spreading out from somewhere, or pointing back to somewhere. So there is a kind of mythical homeland you're looking back at that may not be realistic or something you aspire to move to or plan to rebuild until the Zionist movement starts at the very end of the 19th century in any great numbers. But you still have that center you're looking back at. You do say next year in Jerusalem. It's an idealized center. You know, it's like, I'm living in this random place I'm in, but that's the place. That's where I would want to go. You know, so there is a center of ideas. I mean, there's all kinds of tractates in the Talmud describing how you offer sacrifices in the temple. Why are they bothering to study that in Baghdad and Poland and Spain? But it's part of this building the castle in the sky of the idealized homeland that they long to go back to in some ways, but aren't doing any practical work to go back to on the ground. So they don't totally surrender the idea of a center. It's just refigured into something else.
Right, but it seems like it feeds into an idea of fatalism to a great degree. I mean, you know, the lack of activism until the late 19th century, when we actually see an activist and a secular activism, and which is what the reality is. It's not religious, as it turns out. They
got tired of praying. They decided to try something else. Then obviously after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135, you have the destruction of Judea. Large numbers of Jewish captives are taken to Rome, again, accelerating this diaspora. The territory itself is renamed Philistia, and Jews scatter to the northern fringes. It does lead to wonderful buildings in the north of Israel that you can see today, of synagogues and other Jewish communities that weren't able to be in Judea proper. But it also, again, puts the kibosh in any kind of political aspirations. Why was Masada chosen by the Zionist movement as a central national shrine? And what happens if the story was just invented by Josephus, this death by suicide instead of slavery? So why was this chosen by the Zionist movement as a national shrine?
Well, it's the sacrifice. You know, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. That's not the point. The point is the mythological or foundational myth that it has to be for the Jewish nation. And so, you know, for the sacrifice for independence, you know, every nation has to have its myths that feed into the justification for its existence and for its ethical values. Masada has become that.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts?
I'd also add that I think it encourages the values and sort of mental state that is useful when building a new nation. You want to encourage people to be devoted, to be sort of idolizing the idea of never backing down, of keeping to fight for your independence no matter what. That's very useful to encourage essentially your soldiers to feel if you want them to fight a war better and have a better chance of succeeding, is by instilling these kind of, you don't want Josephus's who go ahead and this is going really bad, I'm going to surrender to the enemy and go write books for them. You know, you want them to keep fighting to the end and to have this really emotional bond to doing it. It's useful.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think, it was interesting, certainly when we were in Israel a couple of years ago, it was interesting that there are the young recruited soldiers that are being brought to all of the different historical sites of Israel, and certainly one of them being Masada. And again, I think from the same thing that Rin talks about, it's that, we're going to create this vision of, we're going to stand up for this. These are brave people, and, you need to be brave to hold on to the land of Israel or die, I guess, for it as well. So again, I think that they take this, very seriously.
And it's also part of their claim of roots. This is where we were. This is where our people were. We are a reestablishment of this old kingdom. And you could argue this is the last sort of major expression of Jewish independence. I mean, the Bar Kokhba revolt is, a little bubble. This lasted 7 years. And this was like the last moment of independence. It reminds me of a scene at the end of the film Letters from Iwo Jima, which is about the American invasion of Iwo Jima, but from the Japanese perspective. And at the very end of the film, Ken Watanabe, who is playing the general who was in charge of the Japanese defense, has fled after a Banzai attack on the airfield at night. And, it's been this terrible struggle for his soldiers. And he's about to commit suicide. And he asks his aide who's with him, are we still on Japanese territory? They're like in this little corner of the island that the Americans just haven't gotten to yet. And his aide says, yes, we are. And so he says, good. And then he does the suicide there at that moment. And it reminds me of that Masada, this is the last gasp of freedom. I'm going to die free in this little corner rather than be captured and dishonored and fight. Yeah, Al.
Yeah, you think about it, two countries always have remember the Alamo Valley Forge, and this is kind of, we're a legitimate thing, and
right,
legitimizes it.
Right. Which leaders, institutions, and practices replaced priests, the Jerusalem temple, and sacrificial worship in this period? How does this relate to modern Jewish life, and why is this transition important? So, who replaced the priests?
The rabbis.
The Pharisees.
Right, the Pharisees, who are evolving into rabbis basically by this time. In other words, me. What replaces the Jerusalem temple?
The synagogue.
Now you have the synagogues, plural is maybe better because there's lots of them in different places. And what replaces the sacrificial worship?
Study of the Torah. And
study of the Torah and reciting of prayers. In fact, you even recite the prayers 3 times a day, just as there were 3 times a day daily sacrifices. And this transition is important because this is the groundwork for the rabbinic Judaism that we are the inheritors of. And it also demonstrates that you can radically change Jewish tradition. If you can go from killing animals to not killing the animals, that's a big change. Or going to Jerusalem and not going to Jerusalem for a pilgrimage. I mean, changing your leadership to a more or less male meritocracy compared to hereditary priests. That's a radical change. So, this is one more major transition that demonstrates that major transitions are part of Jewish history.
I was going to say, it's interesting that if you look at, what happened, because it's been 2,000 years now since the whole concept of the rabbis. And if you look what happened before that, it seemed like there was I don't know if there was, maybe there was a lot of radical change there then, but it seems like we may have had almost less radical change in the sense that rabbis are still around and doing their thing.
Right. And Rabbinic Judaism, you can say, had a stable hold. Well, it took a while to establish because they didn't really have universal control until maybe the days of the Talmud in 400 or 500 of the Common Era, and even a little afterwards. And that lasted until the dawn of modernity and emancipation in the 1700s. So it lasts about 1200 years or so of more or less a stable system. That is a good long stretch. But you could argue the priests were in charge more or less from 500 BCE until about 70 of the Common Era, albeit with some Maccabee intervention and so on. But priestly Judaism, a la Second Temple, had a good long run too. The Monty Python thing is no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. No one expects the empire to fall. The Roman Empire didn't expect to fall. The Byzantine Empire didn't expect to fall. The Arab empires didn't expect to fall. No one expects the Tartar invasion, but those things happen, and for those who assume America is always going to be the predominant hegemonic power in the world, empires rise, empires fall, sings King George in Hamilton. So finally, number 6, in historical retrospect, should the destruction of the Jerusalem temple be remembered as a bad event, a good event, or a mixed event? What's your assessment of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple? Bad event, a good event, or mixed? Go ahead, Lori.
I think it depends on what perspective you want to look at. If you want to look at the perspective of Judaism existing today in the current world, then it's a good event, because the religion that was centered on a temple that was in one place and you had to do sacrifices and go to it doesn't have a great amount of, it's going to end up being sort of a cult that disappears perhaps, or remains a very small religion in a little area. Now, an exception a little bit is Islam, because you do have sort of a center area that's Mecca, and people make the pilgrimage, make the Hajj, and so you could say, well, that maybe could have been the future of Judaism, maybe, I don't know. But the way it was set up with the priests and the sacrifices and sort of the exclusivity, if you will, of the Hebrews, didn't make it for being a very universalistic religion at all. And its prospects for survival would have been more limited, I think. The transition that it went underneath the rabbis made it so that it was going to be more durable for time. So that's my interpretation.
I agree. I just don't think it was universal, though. I mean, Judaism has never really been a universalizing.
Well, you're right. That's not the right,
like Islam or Christianity.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's not the right, because we're not out there evangelical. There's not since a long time ago. There hasn't been any evangelical aspects. That's true. That was a misstatement. But yeah, but you understand.
Otherwise, but everything else was good. So like B+.
I think it's a mixed thing for those sort of reasons. But I think probably it's more bad for multiple reasons. I mean, one, of course, just because of all the crap that happened to all the poor people living at that point in time. And I mean, the thing is, we as individuals may not have been alive, but probably all their suffering and death was probably more significant than negative effects from the temple lasting longer. But I don't know that the temple staying put would have had as much of, I don't know that would have prevented somewhat of a similar Judaism developing, because so much of it was developing before the temple was made. The rabbis had already essentially undercut a lot of the rules. The diaspora had already undercut a lot of the rules of being near Jerusalem, of actually engaging in the sacrifices. And the thing is, I mean, the world continues to go on. It would have continued to be difficult to go ahead and have everyone engaging in temple sacrifices. There would have continued to be conflict about the priests and who has to do that. I mean, it may have been that the rabbis, got enough popular support when there were some really nasty priests, and the idea of the priests being that important could have become less important. I mean, it became less important in. I know I'm not. It's kind of late for me here, so my communication is not all that clear. But I mean, the sacrifices and stuff became something that was taken out of the liturgy with the Reform movement, for instance, because it became problematic in people's minds. I'm not sure that might have happened much earlier if people had to go ahead and actually contend with the fact that there's a group of political priests in Jerusalem who are doing this that we really don't like, and we're having to send money over there, and there's this group of rabbis who say, prayer is just as good of a sacrifice almost. Maybe we don't need to focus on the killing of the animals as long as we do the prayer. And it may have somewhat developed that way because it wasn't so easy to essentially idealize the temple. When you have a real temple, all the problems about having a real temple kind of become apparent when you have a diaspora and you have various factions arguing about the right way to do it.
Well, it's an interesting counterfactual of what would have happened to Judaism if the temple had continued and other things were happening differently. Al, you were going to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say too, and until the destruction, the Romans tolerated monotheism. And the Romans really wanted to. They could have made it completely illegal, and we'd all be worshiping multiple gods today.
Yeah, and that worked so well when they tried to ban Christianity. Throwing Christians to the lions and making it illegal. It only made the movement more successful. So, you have to wonder, the unintended consequences of trying to prohibit something are sometimes it becomes even more successful. I mean, look, anything that gets rid of a hereditary leadership, I would say is a positive step. Okay? Some kind of meritocracy, some kind of status based on study, that's a good thing. But thousands of people suffering and dying, that's not good. Having that radical break in tradition that causes dislocation, and not having an absolute center does lead to some kind of fraying and splintering of the community. So what we'll see next time when we come back together is how the rabbis managed that transition. They had to explain the theological conundrum of a God allowing his own house to get destroyed. Okay, punish the people, but why are you burning your own house? And so they had to answer that question, but also they had to answer, what do we do now? If that's where we atone for our sins, what do we do now? If that's where we worship the God the way he wanted to be worshiped, what do we do now? And how do we know what the God wants us to do? Well, that's where the rabbis come in, between study of the written Torah and something new they come up with, the concept of an oral Torah. But we'll hear more about the oral Torah when we come back in January.